Governor Gretchen Whitmer declared a state of emergency over the weekend to bring more energy to Michigan home.
20% of our economy is tied to the auto industry, which depends on a steady flow of goods from our largest and closest trading partners.
I would say in the last month, we've seen gas price wars, which we never really experienced too much before.
Lines of vehicles are now stretching for blocks outside gas stations across the Midwest, as frustrated drivers wait with little idea of when relief will come. Some pumps have already gone completely dry, while others are rationing fuel with strict limits on each customer. The spark behind this chaos leads back to Alberta, the powerhouse of Canada's oil sector, where Ottawa made the decision to choke off shipments to the United States in retaliation for Washington's freshly imposed tariffs. It didn't take long for the ripple effects to spread. Within days, gasoline prices shot up to levels unseen in years, squeezing both Canadian and American households. Trucking corridors that carry food and essential products began to jam, straining supply lines. Governors in several states quickly sounded the alarm, pressuring federal leaders to act before the situation spirals further. Yet energy analysts warn the window is closing fast. If flows are not restored soon, the northern United States faces the very real threat of a widespread fuel and goods shortage, a scenario no one is prepared to handle. Among the first states to feel the blow was Washington, the trade hub of the Pacific Northwest. With nearly 800 kilometers of shared border with British Columbia and critical ports like Seattle and Tacoma, the state has long acted as the front door for Canadian oil shipments. It not only fuels itself but also supports neighboring Oregon, Idaho, and even parts of Alaska. But when Alberta struck back against U.S. tariffs by cutting energy exports, Washington was left directly in the crossfire. Overnight, oil deliveries through the Peace Arch and Sumas crossings plunged by more than 60%. Storage tanks at Anacortes and Cherry Point collapsed to emergency lows, while tankers that usually filled up at Seattle's docks left empty. The fallout was immediate. From Spokane to Bellingham, drivers faced stations displaying out-of-fuel signs or strict rationing of 8 to 10 gallons per vehicle. Rural areas were hit harder still, with some pumps closing entirely. Long lines formed before sunrise as residents scrambled to get whatever was left. While prices soared beyond $6 a gallon, levels not seen in 2 decades, the shortages rippled across industries. Fishermen in Puget Sound stayed anchored, unable to fuel boats. Freight companies canceled nearly a third of scheduled runs, sending supply chains into disarray. For apple and cherry growers, the crisis was a nightmare. Harvest season loomed, but no one could guarantee their crops would ever make it to market. Analysts warned that if the crunch continued, prices could rocket toward $7 a gallon. Shipping traffic through Seattle and Tacoma would collapse, and small businesses dependent on steady transport might not survive. In the industrial heartland, Michigan was next to stagger under the shock. Once celebrated as America's auto capital, the state relies heavily on crude flowing through Alberta's pipelines, especially Line 5 and Enbridge's main network. Even small interruptions are enough to shake the system. But this retaliation was no minor disruption. It was a hammer strike. Within just 3 days, fuel shortages swept across Detroit, Flint, and Grand Rapids. Prices leapt from $3.95 to $4.65 in less than a week. The effects quickly spread through Michigan's economy. The state's role as a critical logistics artery for the Great Lakes region meant trucking companies had to cancel long-haul deliveries into Ohio and Illinois. Frozen food suppliers in Detroit sounded alarms about collapsing cold chains as shipments were delayed or canceled outright. Automakers in Detroit, Dearborn, and Lansing voiced growing concerns about stalled materials. With shipments delayed, plants began cutting shifts rather than leaving workers idle on the floor. Governor Gretchen Whitmer moved quickly, declaring a state of energy emergency. She ordered reserves released and extended working hours for truck drivers. Lansing even floated a suspension of the state's fuel tax to ease the burden on families. But beyond stopgaps, officials knew only one thing could stabilize Michigan's situation. Washington and Ottawa would need to negotiate directly to restore pipeline flows. Meanwhile, New York faced its own emergency. Communities along the St. Lawrence River, particularly in St. Lawrence, Jefferson, and Franklin counties, were among the first to crack under the shortages. Dependent on steady flows from Quebec and Ontario, these towns saw gas stations shutting down within days of Alberta's export squeeze. In rural stretches, people drove 50 to 60 kilometers just to find a station still operating, an added strain on farmers and small businesses. In Watertown and Plattsburgh, long lines began forming before dawn, with drivers limited to 8 to 10 gallons. Ambulances were given priority. Within a week, gasoline prices jumped more than 30%, averaging over $5 a gallon statewide. Along the border, prices reached $5.30 to $5.50. The highest residents had seen in years. The economic pain seeped into daily life. Households braced for rising grocery bills, businesses reeled from higher transport costs, and local officials scrambled to manage a crisis no one was prepared for. Further west, Minnesota, deep in the Midwest, and reliant on crude moving through Manitoba and Ontario, could not escape the spiral. Within days of Alberta's cuts, shortages swept the state. In Minneapolis, major chains like BP, Holiday, and Speedway limited customers to 10-12 gallons. In Duluth, authorities imposed a rotating fuel schedule, assigning neighborhoods specific hours to refuel. By 5 a.m., cars were already lined up, racing to fill tanks before their window closed. Prices jumped more than 25% in a single week, averaging nearly $5 a gallon. In rural and suburban counties, costs climbed past $5.20. Families cut back on errands, shifted to remote work, and rationed every trip. Businesses fared no better. Trucking and delivery firms saw costs soar by 30–40%. Farmers in Stearns and Nobles counties scrambled to fuel equipment, fearing ruined harvests if tractors and grain dryers ran out. Minnesota's governor urged restraint, asking residents to save fuel for essentials. Talks began with Gulf Coast suppliers, but experts warned relief could take weeks. Without Canadian flows, Minnesota faced a prolonged crisis threatening farms, freight, and families alike. In North Dakota, the irony was bitter. The state pumps oil from the Williston Basin, yet still relies on refined products from Alberta and the Great Lakes. Farmers, in the middle of wheat and soybean harvests, left tractors idle without diesel. Trucking firms hauling crude faced delays, causing a chain reaction through the region's energy network. Freight costs soared, and along the border, black market sellers began offering fuel at 30% markups. Governor Doug Burgum appealed to Washington for federal reserves before the crisis spiraled beyond control. In Montana, where vast distances make fuel a lifeline, the situation was no better. In Billings and Great Falls, drivers lined up before sunrise, rationed to 8 to 10 gallons. In Kalispell and Missoula, stations simply shut their doors. Truckers moving frozen goods left warehouses stacked with spoiled food. Small trucking firms folded under soaring costs, while farmers scaled back work mid-season. Food prices surged across the state, and in rural towns with few stations, entire communities were cut off. Authorities prioritized reserves for ambulances, hospitals, and fire crews just to maintain public safety. Even small states like Vermont were not spared. Dependent almost entirely on supplies from Quebec and New York, the state saw imports drop by 40% within a week, a nationwide emergency that few in Washington, Ottawa, or Wall Street seem prepared to handle. The fuel crunch has already pushed families into desperation, grounded fleets of trucks, and forced industries to their knees. And this isn't just about a few empty gas stations. It's about what happens when two trading giants weaponize energy in a game of political chicken, with millions of ordinary citizens caught in the middle. Already, international contracts are being rewritten. Canadian producers are redirecting barrels overseas, locking in deals with buyers in Europe and Asia, who are all too eager to snap up discounted shipments. Meanwhile, American importers scramble to fill the gap, paying record premiums on foreign oil while passing the cost directly to households. The result? Fuel bills climbing to levels unseen in a generation, freight companies teetering on bankruptcy, and small-town economies one shock away from collapse. The warnings are stark. If the standoff drags on, shortages could become a permanent feature of daily life, reshaping everything from food prices to commuting patterns. For decades, Americans assumed the pumps would always flow. Now that illusion has shattered, and the question hanging over the country is simple. What if fuel scarcity isn't the exception, but the new normal?